Well, good afternoon and welcome everybody to this seminar series, The Future of Taxation in the EU, organized by the European People's Party and hosted by MEP Isabel Benjumea. Today, as you know, we are holding this second seminar of the series in which we will focus on green taxation for the future of the EU. That's today's title. And next Friday, we will have the final seminar, in which we will discuss digital taxation. You will receive information about this next week, even though you've already received bits of it in this week's email. As noted in the invitation, and I've also mentioned this in the Zoom chat, this seminar we will follow the Chatham House rules, and therefore we will record this for the purpose of writing a paper following the discussion with the main conclusions and recommendations of today's discussion. I kindly ask you again to mute yourselves if you're not speaking, so that we don't have any background noise. And well, today the panel is formed by Jonas Grafstrom, researcher at the Radio Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, and Carlo Stagnaro, director of the Digital Economy Observatory at the Istituto Bruno Leoni, Italy. They will speak roughly for 15 minutes each, and then we will open the discussion with the rest of the participants. But first, let us hear a few welcoming words from Gabriel Orriaga, MP in Spain. Gabriel?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Only a very brief words about the matter that we have now in hands. Well, we all know the theoretical basis of externalities about environmental taxes and the good taxes, and about all the theory about property rights and these ideas of codes and so on. So we know a lot about the problems of pollution and the problem of how to transform these costs inside the economical process. The problem here is always the same, that usually we try, when we speak about public finance, we always have conflicting goals. In one hand, we try to generate additional resources to maintain the European budget, but on the other hand, we try to contribute to a more environmentally sustainable EU economy. And not always these two goals are or can be obtained with the same measures. Maybe that if we need additional resources and we want a strong and competitive European economy, the environmental taxes are not the best solution. And maybe that if we want more green Europe, environmental taxes don't be the best answer. So we need to be very clear about what we are prosecuting, and define our instruments in coherence with that. And only three political considerations to be prevent about three very clear problems from my point of view. First is that this kind of taxes provokes fiscal illusion. It's not very easy for the taxpayers to perceive clearly this kind of taxes, and so it's not clear, or it's not easy to take it in consideration in the political debate. Secondly, maybe some equity problems. This kind of taxes usually are not the more just or more accurate to distribute the tax burden between different citizens. And last, the national interest. The starting point is very different between different countries in the European Union, and this kind of taxes may affect differently for one country and another. No? Simply, if you want to see very, very clearly, more development countries usually have best environmental patterns, and probably the not so developed countries has more problems to comply with environmental norms or laws. No? So that's all. No, I think that there are many things to debate about this kind of taxes. It's very clear that in the future, in the immediate future of the EU, we will have this kind of taxes more clearly present in all our countries and all in the European level. So I think that this seminar is really important and useful in these moments. Nothing more. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I also wanted to say just a few words on behalf of Fundación Civismo, which is also collaborating in the organization of these seminars. So founded in 2009, we are a classical liberal think tank based in Madrid. And as a matter of fact, we focus on work on policy issues and especially taxation. It's worth mentioning here our Día de la Liberación Fiscal, or Tax Freedom Day. And well, therefore, it's a great pleasure to be part of this initiative of the EPP. Anyway, let us start with the panel and our first speaker today, Jonas Grafstrom. Jonas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll see. I'll share my screen in a few seconds. There we go. I think you should see my presentation now. Is this the case?
Yes.
Excellent. So I thought I would talk about framing this issue, because I have given out a new book, so that's mainly what I will talk about. But how I see the frame now in Europe, that we have quite a big environmental problem. At least we talk a lot about that. And we have the corona problem, and we have huge spending for that. So there are basically two big issues where the state can expand its taxation power, mainly because we have to pay for the corona issue. So me and a colleague released a book last week that we called it's based on Andrew McAfee's book, More from Less, that he came out with last year. And Andrew McAfee at MIT, he studied emissions and environmental resource use in the US, and found that in almost everything he looked at, more than 60 different topics, the US has gone down in resource use, emissions, and everything else. So we were quite interested in, okay, has this happened in Sweden? So therefore we set out to make this book, and we collaborated with Andrew McAfee a little bit also. And me and Christian Sandström, who is a professor at the University of Jönköping, looked at the relationship between growth and sustainability in Sweden. And we did it mainly because a lot of people, at least in media in Sweden, say that, we can't have growth at the moment anymore. They want to almost degrowth to save the environment. And our point is we can actually have both growth and sustainable development. And I think that will be a quite important frame for the EPP to set to make policies easier. And something we have seen is that people have a quite negative view about the development in the world. We are quite inspired by Hans Rosling. He was a now deceased Swedish professor. He looked a lot on the kind of developing world and world poverty. And throughout his entire career, when he asked people what they thought about what's happening, are we having less poor people in the world? Are children going to school? Are diseases going down? even if it was parliamentarians, world leaders, or just the students, they thought, everything is getting much worse. So when he asked, are more or less children going to school today than 20 years ago, then most people said, but no, it's, fewer people, more people are poor. And what Rosling showed that, the world is getting quite good, actually. We have almost all development goals are, checked decades before they were supposed to be checked. Steven Pinker, a Harvard professor, wrote a quite good book also about the better angels of nature, why violence has declined. And he showed that, murders, fights, and terrorist threats were much lower in Europe and the US than ever, but we perceived it as much higher. And my friend Johan Norberg, a Swedish author, have also looked at progress, where he showed that, everything is getting better, but people don't believe it. So we have started then to have some discussion with students and company leaders. So we usually ask this question. So since 1990, the Swedish GDP has risen by 85%. So it's quite a lot, 85% GDP rise. Population is up with 1.6 millions. And under the period, the CO2 emissions have. And what do you think that, Swedish university student thinks when they get this question? Somebody. I can take it. It's maybe not the easiest form. So we get usually, I don't have a chat. Usually, C. That would be great if they thought that. No. So usually, the Swedish university students think that A, emissions has gone up in Sweden and a lot, and they get very surprised and sometimes even angry when we say, but no, the emissions in Sweden is down with 28%, which is quite amazing. Here we can see. So this is data from the OECD and the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. So while we are twice as rich, we still reduced emissions. And this is a pattern that we have seen in almost the whole of Europe. So this is World Bank data. So here we have just mapped from these different starting points. Most are from 1990, some are from 1994, and seen how much has emission changed during this period. And as we can see, almost everyone has kind of decreased them significantly, even though GDP has gone up between 100 to 160% in these countries. And Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was up 360%, but that was, of course, the starting year was just after the war. So yeah, makes it a lot easier. But as we see it, yeah, we are making quite a good progress, actually, with this, but people don't believe that. And then the follow-up question is, when I kind of have grasped that emissions are going down while the economy is growing, is, haven't we exported the emissions to other countries then? And their answer is, yeah, it might be the case. It could be the case. But when we have looked at it in Sweden, we don't have perfect data for this. We have just from 2008. And then from 2008, we have seen a 10% decline in foreign emissions. So whatever we import emits less emissions. And then I say, but aren't we importing everything from China? And then when we ask about how much do they think we import from China, it's usually around 50% of Swedish imports are supposed to come from China. But that is, of course, not the case. In Sweden, it's just 5.8% that are coming from China. If it takes Spain, it's 6.8, Italy, 6.9. So it's a quite low amount. For a Swedish case, we import from the European Union. So the European countries in general stands for 82% of Swedish emissions. And as we have seen, the European countries' emissions has gone down quite a lot, which affect our imported emissions quite a lot. So we are, in a way, helping each other here. A second question we usually ask them to kind of drive home our point is, since 1990, the number of cars in Sweden, they have increased with 1.2 millions. So did the emission from car traffic A go up with 33%, B with 11%, or decline with 21%? And after a while, we have quite a lot of questions. They start to get the point. It is getting better. But it's quite remarkable that you can add this many cars. So from 3.6 million to 4.8 million cars rolling around on the streets, and you still reduce emissions. And it might seem surprising, but if you think about it, it's not. I remember my grandpa's old car. It was 2.5 ton big Toyota. It was almost circling down gasoline from the emissions pipe. So if we compare a quite modern car that is sold today, you need around 0.4 liters of gasoline to get 10 kilometers, while grandpa's car needed roughly 1.2 to 1.5 liters of gasoline for the same amount. So we have reduced it by almost 70%. Quite remarkable, I think. So here's the total emissions and the emissions from cars in Sweden. And it's then, I think, thousands of tons of CO2. So it's quite a remarkable decline there. Also, at least when you add that many cars. This is also quite interesting. So here we have electricity use. That was maybe what surprised me the most when we wrote the book. So we ask, what has happened with electricity use? And then the answer is that it has only increased with 3% in Sweden, according to the Swedish Energy Agency. But if we look at the International Association for Energy Economy, they say it's just 0.07% increase, even though the economy grew with 85%. So this is the kind of, sorry for having Swedish down there, but it's industry, housing, heating, losses, and the kind of transporting who use electricity. So a 30-year, almost 90% bigger economy, 3% more electricity. So it seems we can do it without screwing up the environment too much. And then the question is, why is this? And one of the theories we have is that for a company to survive, they have to be sustainable. They might not care about being sustainable, but it's almost a necessary condition to survive on a market to be that. So, for example, I'm Swedish, so I can take IKEA. One of their big selling points in the beginning was that they didn't, screw the furniture together. So they gain huge labor savings, but also transportation savings. So, transporting a bookcase that are not built is quite big, but these packages, it's insane, extremely sustainable compared to the previous alternatives. Same with the kind of simple Coca-Cola bottle. Coca-Cola, of course, don't want to, just give away more aluminium than they need to. So we looked at the history of the aluminium can, and they were, the first ones were produced in 1959. Coca-Cola and Pepsi started using them in the 1960s. In the beginning, they were weighing almost 80 grams of aluminium went into a can. Today, they are between 15 and 14 grams. So a saving of almost 80%. And there are a lot of different technological devices, but the newest one is that they have, instead of this chubby jar, the jar is quite, slim. And that reduces the aluminium amount a lot. Same thing with the lights we have at our homes. Most of them are 80 to 90% down in energy use, and the fridge that the Coca-Cola bottle is in is also, compared to my parents when they were growing up, down with 80% energy use. So technology gets better. Wind power has expanded quite a lot, have reduced in price with almost 10% per year for a quite long period. And the 10% per year over a 5-year period, it's almost a 50% decrease in prices. Same thing, they are getting bigger. So, and not in so long time. I think from year 2000 to now, it's almost a kind of time between World War I and World War II. And you can see the two different planes from that. It's quite a jump in technology in short time. And I'm quite sure when we put so much resources in technological development, and that a lot will happen. So the conclusion, I would say, in this book, and I think that we should try to sell, is that, yeah, sure, politics works for some. Most it's market driven, but also technological change. I will just put in one more point before my 15 minutes are up. And a little bit like Gabriel said, we shouldn't rely on environmental taxes. I think that's a quite important point to make, since the point of these environmental taxes is to take something away, maybe emissions or reduce. So it will never be a stable tax base. I just plotted this to say this shows how many percent of GDP is environmental taxes, and as we can see, most countries has actually been going down over time. And that's, of course, if we become more sustainable, we will have less tax income from these sources, which is good. But then, yeah, new tax bases are needed. So sadly, it's just the book is in Swedish. We have a working paper in English, but it's one day it will be English also. So we have 60 graphs, more than 100 emissions, pollutants, resources, and it seems like almost everything is going down, which is quite remarkable. And I would love to see kind of a similar book from Spain. It will be interesting to see the development there. Yeah. Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you so much, Jonas, for this really very interesting presentation. Carlo, you're up.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and for this opportunity. Let me just share my presentation as well. I took the opportunity of having a slightly longer time than expected to add a couple of slides on the situation of Spain in particular. What I'm talking about is the situation of green taxation and green subsidies all over Europe in general, and as I said, in Spain in particular. And the perspective from which I will talk about this is let's say the mismatch between what taxes and what green taxes and subsidies are supposed to do in theory and what they actually do in practice. When making this kind of argument, I am perfectly aware that there are a number of very good political reasons why the situation is like it is today, rather than like free marketeers would like it to be. But still, I think it is important, especially having the opportunity of talking directly to policymakers, to promote, to contribute to an understanding of how the situation, of how the landscape could be made at the same time consistent with the free market approach, and also consistent with the environmental goals that we have set at the European and national level. Before I get into the details, just one short note on the environmental goals. As you know, we had set a goal of reducing carbon emissions by 40% by 2030, and I think today the EU Council has approved actually the Commission's proposal to increase the target to minus 55%. I don't want to discuss whether 55% or 40% is realistic and whether it can be achieved in a cost-effective way. The only point I want to make is that the more ambitious the goal, the more rational the policy design should be, because the risk of wasting resources and taking resources from the taxpayers' pockets and spending them in a wasteful way is larger, and its potential impact on growth is also larger accordingly. So while an issue to be debated is whether it makes sense to cut emissions by 55% in 9 years, the main point I would like to raise is that the more ambitious the goal, the more careful you should be in designing how you want to achieve it. Let me see if I can. Okay. So what is the situation of green taxes in Europe? First of all, we call green taxes not just taxes that are explicitly designed with the goal of achieving some kind of environmental target, but every kind of tax which helps to achieve environmental targets, regardless to their stated targets. In Europe in 2018, the total revenue from green taxes, which were mainly taxes on energy consumption, was as high as 270 billion euro. So a very large amount of money, which dramatically increased, by the way, as compared to like 10 years ago or so. At the same time, in Europe, I mean, when I say Europe, I'm referring to EU 27, so I'm not counting the UK in. In Europe, we awarded subsidies to energy sources, we awarded energy subsidies worth almost 160 billion euro in 2018. And both the amount, the expected revenue from energy taxes and the expected expenditure in energy subsidies is bound to increase over time. And it is bound to increase even more if the minus 55% target is taken into account. So the question that one should ask himself or herself vis-a-vis these huge numbers is whether is there any kind of rationality in the design of taxes and subsidies. As Gabriel told in his introduction, in theory, taxes should be levied upon energy consumption or other behaviors that produce external costs, and subsidies may be directed to support behaviors or technologies that produce external benefits. The definition of external cost is pretty much clear. The definition of what is an external benefit is not clear at all. For example, many people believe that solar power or wind power or other intermittent renewable energies produce an external benefit insofar as they replace carbon emitting energies, but in fact, they are just not producing a cost. I mean, not producing a cost is not the same as producing a benefit. So from a purely environmental economics point of view, one can make an argument for taxing oil and gas and coal. It is much harder to make an argument for subsidizing wind and solar and nuclear power and so on and so forth. This will be actually the key of my concluding remarks as I get to the end of my presentation. Now, let's look at the situation of green taxes and green subsidies in Europe to understand whether there is any rationality in the design. Of course, the answer is implicit in the question. No, there is no rationality whatsoever, but there are many ways of looking at this fact. First of all, since the external costs from similar technologies or similar energy sources is pretty much the same whether you are consuming coal or oil or natural gas in Spain or in Bulgaria or in Italy or in Sweden, one would expect to observe similar degrees of taxation. Instead, we are treating the same kind of externalities like local pollution or greenhouse gases or whatever in much different ways. There is a very, very huge difference in the way we tax energy consumption all over Europe. As you can see, Germany and Italy, by the way, are among the countries which are more avid of energy taxation. Sweden is like here. Spain is here, so Spain is apparently one of the countries which are taxing less energy as compared to the energy content. I mean, so I'm not looking at the revenue as a share of GDP, but how energy is taxed per unit of energy content per megawatt hour. At the same time, if you look at how different energy sources are taxed, you would see that the taxation is totally erratic. You can make no rational argument that gasoline pollutes more than coal, and therefore it should be taxed more. In fact, the only criterion that can be drawn from observing how taxation is distributed among energy sources in Europe is that European member states tend to tax more the energy sources for which the demand is more rigid, which suggests that the real purpose of taxation is not achieving environmental benefits. It is rather achieving fiscal revenue, which is fine, which is fair. I mean, states have a lot of spending to fund, and for any given level of expenditure, you have to find tax bases. But please do not tell that this has anything to do with the environment. I mean, this has to do with pensions and subsidies and whatever, but it has got nothing to do with environmental rationality. But still, if you want to think of energy taxes as something which has to do with the environment, you should start from here, and you should try to reconcile the taxation choices with the actual external costs deriving from using gasoline or gas oil or electricity or natural gas or coal or nuclear or whatever else. And the other side of taxes are subsidies. And again, you would see a very different situation depending on which member state are you looking at or which energy source you are looking at. On the one hand, energy subsidies have been growing to an unprecedented rate in the past 10 years. They grew by between 60 and 70% between 2008 and 2018. This is by the way, this is an estimate of the expenditure in subsidies in real terms, not in nominal terms. So in real terms, the EU-wide expenditure on energy subsidies grew from 95 billion euro in 2008 to 159 billion euro in 2018. Who is benefiting from this expenditure, from this subsidization? A significant amount, about a third today, of energy subsidies goes to fossil fuels. The level of benefit, of fiscal benefit for fossil fuels has been pretty much steady all over time. It was 51 billion in 2008, 50 billion in 2018. This is a EU-wide estimate. The other big recipient of energy subsidies is renewable energy sources, especially renewable sources of electricity like wind power and solar power, whose contributions grew from 22 billion euro in 2008 to 73 billion euro in 2018. Of course, this is the aggregate amount of the total amount of subsidization to fossil fuels and renewable energy sources. If we look at the amount of subsidization per megawatt hour, the difference is even more striking. I'm coming on this in a moment. Another important point to have in mind is that a large part of the 50 billion euro subsidies to fossil fuels is designed as a subsidy to consumption. For example, discounts on the price of gasoline for the transportation professionals. On the contrary, a very large part of the subsidization for renewable energy sources is in the form of price support. You are subsidizing production. To some extent, production subsidy is also present in the fossil fuel dominion. Spain, in particular, is a country which is apparently particularly generous to the domestic production of some fossil fuels, according to the EU Energy Prices and Costs report. But still, even in Spain and in most European countries, a large part of fossil fuel subsidies have the form of subsidies to consumption. On the contrary, subsidies to renewable energy production are in the form of subsidies to production, like direct subsidies or green certificates or regulated tariffs for energy sources and so on and so forth. If you look at the right panel in my slides, you will see that the amount of subsidization per unit of energy produced by technology is very much diverse, depending on which technology you are talking about. This is again a European average. You can find different data and different figures for any specific member state. Solar photovoltaic is by far the most heavily subsidized source of energy, both if you look at total numbers and if you look at the per unit of energy produced. If you look at this latter figure, which is, I think, more interesting and more important to look at, solar power gets on average 248 euro per megawatt hour, which is basically twice as much what biomass takes, and biomass takes almost twice as much as wind onshore energy production takes. Wind offshore is also very much subsidized. Now, what's the message from this graph? Is that you have a number of renewable technologies. They produce the same kind of environmental benefit, assuming that you can define not polluting as a benefit, but you are paying this kind of benefit very different amounts and very diverse amounts. I mean, not producing a ton of CO2 with solar power costs 248 euro. Not producing the same amount of CO2 with wind will cost half as much or even less, and buying a CO2 certificate in the ETS system in Europe will cost about 25 euro. Now, the graph is not about the cost per ton of CO2 abated. The cost is different from the numbers that you can see there, but the ratio is pretty much the same. So, you know, the question is, how is it possible to have a policy that pays X what you can buy for a tenth of X within the same legal framework and within the same institutional framework, and while achieving exactly the same result, which is reducing total emissions by 1 ton of CO2. Of course, this is something that you can tolerate when the numbers are small, when you are talking about like very energy technologies or energy sources in their very early stages of their industrial maturity. But it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever when you are talking about energy technologies which are technologically mature and which have very little perspective of further technological improvement. If we look at Spain, the situation is pretty much similar to what you can find in the rest of Europe, except that first of all, Spain is one of the largest spender in renewable energies, both on if you look at total amount and if you look at per capita or per megawatt hour of energy. And within renewable energies, the big winner, as you know very well, I think, is solar power. As I said, Spain is also relatively generous in the landscape of the other EU member states with fossil fuels. So an argument can be made, and a thought should be made about how to rationalize both energy taxation and energy subsidization in your country. I mean, about 16 billion euro per year in 2018 is a very large share of your GDP as compared to what you find in other countries. Also, it is useful to look at the policy instrument that you use to subsidize energy. This goes across renewable and fossil fuels alike. And as you shall see, I mean, the largest chunk of this is income or price of support, which is basically 70% of this is renewable tariffs, and the remaining part is support to the production of fossil fuels. Then you have direct transfers or tax expenditures, which are supports basically to energy consumers. So there is a lot of room to rationalize both energy taxes and energy subsidies all over Europe in general, and in Spain in particular. Of course, if you have questions regarding more precise data or specific aspects of how Spain subsidizes energy, I've got most of the data on my computer, and of course I can share them with you, but you can find them on the EU Commission website. Now, why is it important to design in a reasonable way taxation and subsidization? Well, to some extent, Jonas already touched upon the point, so I will be very, very quick on this, which is also my conclusion. Because the way you define taxes and subsidies affects the allocation of resources. And if you design in a wrongful way taxation and subsidization, the impact of misallocation will be larger, and you will have less economic growth, which is a particularly important issue in 2020 as compared to 2019 or any other, let's say, normal year. Generally speaking, economists are quite supportive of forms of carbon pricing and of pricing of negative externalities, but they are very skeptical of policies which have the form of picking winners, like I give this much to solar power, and I give this much to oil, and I give this much to natural gas, and so on and so forth. The reason is that while pricing the environmental externality aligns the private and public cost of the resource, picking winners alters the relative prices of different energy sources and pushes consumers and even investors who have to allocate their resources, and including and particularly in the research and development part of their expenditure, it pushes them to make economically wrong or economically unproductive allocation choices. If you want I mean, the ideal world of economists would be a world where you tax every energy source or even better, every energy use according to the actual external cost that it imposes on society, and you subsidize nothing except perhaps research and development. Clearly, this is just a dream. This is totally impossible. I mean, if you are realistic, but nevertheless, you can push the system and intervene on taxes and subsidies in a way that you make it slightly more consistent with the ideal world rather than with today's world. And you can do that by, I wrote phasing out subsidies. I accept and I understand that this is totally unrealistic, but you can at least reduce subsidies and make subsidies converge towards the same amount. You should award the same kind of subsidy to any energy sources that produces the same environmental benefit. And at the same time, taxes should be designed in a way that they reflect the actual environmental cost, and therefore even taxes should be made more consistent with each other. 1 ton of CO2 is 1 ton of CO2, regardless whether you are emitting it with as a steel maker or driving your car. And therefore, the impact of the tax should be pretty much the same. There can be some reasonable exception just for a few industries like steel and a few others, which are at the same time energy intensive and exposed to international trade. If you do this, I mean, you have on one hand less spending for subsidies, which can be matched by a lower revenue from environmental taxes for the reason that Jonas told. I mean, as the economy becomes more decarbonized and more sustainable, the revenue from environmental taxes will be lower, but also the need to spend money for environmental subsidies will be lower accordingly. So my advice, my general advice is to try to approach energy taxation and subsidization reform in a way that tries to make it as technologically neutral as possible, and to reduce the amount of taxes which are needed by reducing the amount of subsidies which are required to commit to maintain all the promises and all the commitments that have been made in terms of emissions reductions and so on and so forth. Of course, the big question for politicians is how to do that. The only thing an economist can say is that this could work. And this is where I stop. Thank you very much. Let me stop share screen. Okay.
What a terrific last slide, Carlo. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Okay, so let us now begin the discussion. I just like the last time, for those who are repeating today, I will kindly ask you to indicate that in case you want to ask any question or make a comment, because this, at the end of the day, this is a discussion, by writing on the chat or clicking on raising your hand, which is a button that you will also find on the chat, and I will be asking you to formulate the question so that we can keep this as orderly as possible. Okay, so the first questions, I will take a few questions at a time, and then the two experts can reply to them. So we have two questions from Tony Timoner.
Hi, hello. Thank you for your fantastic presentations. Thank you, Carlo and Jonas. I have two questions, one for Jonas and one for Carlo. I think maybe the two of you can answer those. It's the first question, I guess, it comes with tax design. Something that it seems that, for instance, Sweden has developed much further than any other countries. The idea that you tax per carbon you tax the emission of carbon. Like probably you have, I think your taxation is of $100 per ton of carbon equivalent, which is the highest in the world. That seems to be, among all the experts on climate change and those who focus on transition, the most efficient way, and it seems that clear guidance and forward guidance on around taxation using that could probably mitigate all the uncertainty around taxation when we have too complex transaction systems that it's not clear whether you are taxing and what you will revenues. So the first question, I guess, it goes for the two of you, but it's a forward guidance taxation framework that basically has one single element, which is a number on the number of euros or dollars for to tax carbon emissions, the ton equivalent. Is a more efficient way to, and the second question is around all the revenue from taxation that will come from this potential carbon tax. I think in Sweden you probably have significant revenue and earnings from that taxation because you have that $100. The question is that I guess it's an open question for the two of you. I'm curious more about the Swedish case. What is the recycle approach for that revenue, in the sense that what is the allocation of resources of those earnings, and what has been the most efficient way based on Swedish history, and what we can learn from that? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we don't have any further questions thus far, so perhaps we can begin with these two questions, Carlo and Jonas.
Yeah, I might start. Yeah, as you said, it's over $100 per ton. It's quite expensive. It's not very popular, I would say, but it has been around for a while, so it's also accepted. So there are, I would say, bad things and good things with it. A bad thing we have noticed is that it has driven out a lot of the kind of older car fleet from the country, but that doesn't really, reduce world emissions, I would say. So we have seen a lot of, especially the kind of older cars have gone to Eastern Europe and then to Africa. So we're kind of driving out bad cars from Sweden and buying new ones. So we're buying quite a lot of new ones. So I don't know if it was a kind of well thought out plan, but what they do with the money. So sadly, I think it's too much. It's just general fiscal policy, but we have something that is called kind of a green tax refund. So they are trying to kind of shift, kind of taking down income taxes and taking up the so-called green taxes. And it's not the worst idea in the world, but the last year it went to cutting the top tax rate. I thought it was well overdue to do it, but it wasn't that well perceived. So the top rate went from 55 to 50. So it was, a lot of people felt, especially since the Social Democrats did it, they got a lot of flack for that. But there have been some interesting ways to handle the tax system. So when they took away the NOx, NOx is the chemical, it's something when burning. So in the energy producing plants that were emitting this, they constructed an internal tax system. So they had to tax depending on how much they emitted. But in the end of the year, the industry got all the money back. So nothing went into the state budget. And they got back depending on how efficient they were at producing. So that meant that 50% of the firms in this tax system got more money than they paid in. So it was quite popular, and it was quite easy for the worst emitters to put maybe a scrubber on the top of the exhaust pipe. So that is a tax system that was really, really high taxes, but it was quite neutral for the Swedish industry. So that is something I would recommend, actually.
Thank you very much,
Carlo.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Yeah, I absolutely agree that a carbon tax is the most efficient way to deal with this. The level of, I think in deciding the level of the carbon tax, you have to keep in mind two or three targets. One criterion might be I levy a carbon tax which is proportional to the environmental cost of the externality that I'm dealing with. In which case you would aim to, let's say, 50 euro per ton of CO2. A second approach is you levy a carbon tax which is related to the actual target you want to achieve. If in Europe you want to achieve minus 55%, 50 euro per ton of CO2 might not be enough. You have to raise it. I'm not saying that minus 55% is right or wrong. I mean, it's a policy decision. And the third point is how much you need to fund other state expenditure. I mean, a carbon tax or a green tax is still a tax, which is part of a broader tax system. And so it is your choice. Again, it's your policy choice to fund your pension system by taxing more energy and less labor or capital, or vice versa. My personal perspective is that you should design taxes in a way that green taxes at least, in a way that they are as much as possible cost reflective, having in mind how large uncertainties are with regard to what the real cost of climate change is. Let me just share the screen on a report that I downloaded from the OECD, which shows you how crazy is our system. This is the average of taxation across OECD, and it is an estimate of the average effective carbon tax levied on different energy sources. So a ton of CO2, which is emitted by coal, is taxed very, very, very low. The taxation on coal is about 0.73 euro per ton of CO2, vis-a-vis 85 euro if you drive your gasoline-fueled car, and you have a number of figures somewhere in the middle. Now, this is totally irrational. I mean, the climate, for the global climate, the origin of that particular ton of CO2 is totally irrelevant. And of course, this has an impact on resource allocation, and it has an impact on the people's behavior. And there is also one extra point I would like to make, if I have time, Juan, which is this. When we talk about energy taxation and energy in general and climate in general, for some reasons, we tend to have a sort of supply side bias. So we always talk, 99% of the time, on how energy should be produced, and so how much solar power you should have, and how you can phase out coal, and what is the role of nuclear power, and so on and so forth. And we never, or almost never, talk about what happens on the demand side. A carbon tax versus a subsidy scheme, a carbon tax means that it is ultimately the consumers with their actual consumption choices which determine how you cut emissions. So you can cut emissions by investing more in energy efficiency, or by changing the ways you produce electricity, or by switching to alternative fuels like hydrogen or whatever. And I think it's much more economically meaningful to move the burden on the demand side, rather than playing the central planner game and saying, okay, which is what unfortunately we in the European Union are doing, and saying, well, in 2050, I want 53.5% of my energy to be produced by solar power, and 15.2% by something else. This makes totally no sense, no economic sense, at least. I understand the political rationale behind it, but it makes no economic sense at all.